Thank you, everyone. And before I start, I do want to actually acknowledge the traditional owners as well. From what I understood of this particular place, this particular plot of land, that prior to it being the building that it is now, that traditional owners used to actually have this as a meeting place and a cultural place for telling stories. So it's interesting that the ground is still being used for similar sort of activities now. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, lived a very happy, content, and blissfully ignorant woman. Some might have viewed her life as boring, possibly, privileged, more than likely, and possibly even purgatory. Just depends on your perspective. From a young age, she really enjoyed numbers and creating an order out of a jumble. So moving into metallurgical engineering as an adult was just a no-brainer. Engineering just reinforced her natural tendencies and allowed for success, even managing a team of 105 before she was 35. And so her framework of what she had used in her work informed her that maybe that was an okay way of seeing life. Black and white, simple, predictable. Know your inputs, control your controllables, and then with a degree of certainty, you can predict your outputs. And it did kind of work for 37 years. So in effect though, that was me. A lifetime ago, as I said, in a galaxy far, far away. That life of being simple, black and white thinking was going to have to change. I was going to have to retire such simple notions. My happy, content and blissfully ignorant life was going to have to make way for becoming whole. The process began when I'd just moved to Tom Price in the Pilbara region of Western Australia with my husband and at the time 3 small children. The first week we moved to town, a letter arrived. This letter, written by the Department of Community Services on the behalf of a brother who was searching for me. And whilst the letter wasn't completely unexpected, I can't say it was completely welcomed either. It was complicated. You see, it wasn't unexpected because I'd always known I was adopted. That was no surprise. And although my adopted parents had passed many, many years beforehand, there still retained within me a space of deep love and affection and respect for all that they'd given me in my childhood. They were the ones that told me that being adopted meant I was chosen out of all the babies in the hospital, that I just wasn't the result of, the genetic mixing wheel of whatever mum and dad produced, but I was the baby that was seen, I was selected, and I was wanted. And to be frank, not being adopted, I was led to believe was a bit feral. But still, this letter beckoned. The sibling behind it beckoned. I was the family he was searching for. Would I allow myself to be found? With a significant passing in my husband's family, it would be another 4 weeks until I picked up this letter again, still with that question unanswered. Would I allow myself to be found? Up to that point, my engineering framework for assessing life and the challenges of life had been useful. But now, in this situation, it was of no value. It was defunct, and I was starting to realise it. What I also started to realise around the same time was that I was actually 12 weeks pregnant with child number 4. So I knew the inputs and outputs of that situation, so it shouldn't have been such a shock. But it was a shock. And now looking back, I understand it was a shock because my previously very content life and world was unravelling. I was unravelling. As I said before, it was complicated, and obviously the hormones of pregnancy just made it worse. One of the first truths that was uncovered was that I was Aboriginal. I had no idea, no inkling. And my family, I lived in Tom Price. My family lived in Roebourne, which by Pilbara standards is just around the corner and down the road a bit from where I was living. And the distinct likelihood was that in the town of 3,000 people, I would have blood relatives living in that same town. So after the birth of number 4 and waiting for the next lot of school holidays to travel to Perth, it would be 15 months from when I first held this letter until I met the brother who beckoned behind it. It was on a sunny October afternoon, just around the corner and down the road a bit from where we actually are today. It was down at the Rockingham foreshore. And on that afternoon, it was the first relative that I actually hadn't given birth to, my first blood relative that I would ever meet. And the unravelling of my world halted just for a moment. Unfortunately, though, there would be another halt and delay in connecting with my wider family mob. My biological family, my family back in Roebourne, experienced a really significant passing. So now wasn't the time to say, surprise, you have another sister. So I cried my tears in private for a mum I would never meet. I allowed my family I hadn't met to grieve together whilst I grieved alone in Tom Price and waited 12 months. Towards the end of that 12 months, I went to visit a beautiful friend, Josie, in Tom Price. She was an Aboriginal lady that we just met from around town, but I knew she was from Roebourne, the same place where my mum came from, the same town of my heritage. And while she was my friend, I would often sense this bit of disconnect between how she would talk and how I understood what she was talking. I knew there was a disconnect, and there'd often be kind of a bit of a distance, that her mind would be elsewhere. But this day, when I went to visit her, this day was different. This day, at the name of who my birth mother was, she embraced me in what I could only call a hug of coming home. The thing is, I never felt lost. I had grown up with love, but she gave me a hug and communicated. But Josie's hug told me that there was more than what I had ever understood from my previous world. All at the mention of my mum's name and whose daughter I am. And therein began my first lesson in Aboriginality. Plus, in that conversation, Josie told me of her family tree and my family tree and how it actually intersected, such that she was blood family in that town. She was actually my Auntie Josie, not in Western ways of family identity, but in cultural ways, in Nullama ways, in our family mob ways. And also in that conversation, Auntie Josie told me that my mum had been one of 8 and I was part of the biggest family mob, and the excitement that would be amongst that mob in knowing another one was coming home. But she also told me of others who had been taken and were yet to come home. She told me of the grief that remained in communities for the ones who were still disconnected. And I had no idea that decades after active child removals, that there was these bottomless holes of grief that remained. And that afternoon, Auntie Josie gave names to those who grieved and gave names to those bottomless holes of loss that the community has never forgotten. It was a conversation that was equal parts heartbreak and heart coming home. It was a conversation that communicated there is so much that I don't understand as yet. And it was at this point I was no longer unravelling, I was completely undone. It wasn't long after that an uncle heard that I existed, Uncle Cecil. And so plans were made to travel just around the corner and down the road a bit, up to a town close to Roebourne, the town of my heritage. And that evening at his place, the family had assembled to meet me, one that was coming home. My mum was one of 8 and the first to pass, so there were 7 siblings there, either represented or there themselves. When I got there, the family had arranged themselves to huddles to represent each sibling of my mum, the children and the grandchildren. Auntie Josie brought me in, and then Uncle Cecil at his place, he introduced me to each one of every huddle. So he introduced me to his wife, his adult children. It was an introduction of who they are to each other, who they are to my mum who had passed, and who they are to me. It was considered, it was respectful, it was patient. And in my overwhelm of suddenly being thrust into this space with all these people who were now blood relatives, it was so accommodating and accepting of me. It communicated, just like the hug from Auntie Josie beforehand, there is so much richness I had never ever considered or dreamt existed. One of the next lessons of growing into my Aboriginality was discovering that in the culture, my siblings would also be mum and dad for my kids. And one sister in particular taught me how to love in a more rich way to what was used to me. Raising my children without grandparents and with the mindset of, I say engineering, I had been black and white in my thinking. It impacted a lot of my life. But this particular sister, she would love upon my kids with softness. When she first interacted with my kids, it was just like mum. It was just like a mum coming in. And I learnt in Aboriginal culture, you have multiple kids, and as a child you have multiple mums. And it's the same for dads as well. Her love would be with greater softness and with a healthy dose of indulgence. Much like the healthy dose of ice cream, she would slip their ways at different times. And by watching her, I actually grew in my parenting. Have you ever had someone love your children that actually helps you be a better parent? And if you don't have children, have you actually ever been loved in a way that just causes you to be a better person? Not out of shame, not out of guilt, not out of competition, but love, an example. I have. It's a rare gift, and one I never expected. One I couldn't have comprehended even existed. So let me tell you about one particular event that actually dropped me to my knees. It was another time when we'd gone up to the town close to Roebourne and visited with that particular sister. She'd gone to work and I was back at her place with her boys, who I would now consider my boys, and with my kids at her place. Her boys crossed the road, there was an open paddock, and were playing with a bike that had been dumped in the paddock. Typical fun, boys just playing with whatever was in their environment. That was until a white ute pulled up and just hurled abuse at my boys. My sister's boys, but now I consider my boys. It was a foul-mouthed tirade, no way in line with the situation. And in that moment of roughly 42 years old, my heart hurt at the reality of racism. I'd had head knowledge about racism, but I'd had no lived experience. My sister came home later that day and she'd bought bikes for the boys, but actually it was never about the bikes. It's about how some kids grow up in a community and the sense of safety and belonging and acceptance in that community. You know, with the capacity to love much comes the risk of being broken much. Not because those that you love break you, but because their pain actually becomes your pain. So my journey to wholeness has always been in tandem with this brokenness. But in that process, I've also had the privilege of having a front row seat of seeing my family present time and again with resilience, with courage, with dignity and grace. There are lots of stories I could tell, lots of examples that I could give, but I'll start to wrap this up and tell you why I will wrap this scarf around my neck. In connecting with my family, I have researched and discovered a lot more than just what I've told you so far. I'm the 4th generation of women who've been affected by the stolen generation policy. 4 generations. It's not just my story, it's a story of all Aboriginal people. One particular nana, she had fair skin just like me, blue-green eyes just like me. The blues and greens that are in this scarf, that's why I bought it. The fair skin and the blue-green eyes was actually what made her a target for removal from her family. 15 years old, from a station in the back of the Pilbara, but it still wasn't far enough from the policies that would take her away. She came down to Perth and she was here for 6 months before she was labelled a naughty native girl, too set in her ways, identity assigned to her that wasn't her true identity. That label was put on her because she spoke her traditional language. She wouldn't settle down in the mission. She chewed tobacco and she swore too much. There may be some elements of that still relate to me now. Wearing this scarf reminds me that I actually come from really strong stock. I come from a line of women with an unyielding desire and spirit to fight for identity, not what we're told, but who we truly are. I'm also reminded that identity is what we carry on and in our bodies. Just like I can't change the colour of my skin or my eyes, it is part of who I am. I spoke to the artist who actually created the artwork that underlines this scarf. And in the original artwork, there's a transition between the green and the blue, such that the lines aren't defined between the two. And he did that in such a way because the coexisting of two brings a beauty of its own. And I'm reminded of the story of my reconnection to my family and growing into my Aboriginality has always been the coexisting of two emotions, heartbreak and heart coming home. Hugs that heal when you feel undone. Also in speaking to the artist, he told me that the black lines represent the channels that ants carve out, and the white dots are seeds that are deposited in those channels. And seeds speak of the future, speak of what we choose today as to what will grow tomorrow. Let me say what I would hope that we plant today, that we will see fruit of for tomorrow. That we would retire black and white thinking. We would say yes to invitations and opportunities that still beckon now. For those who grieve for the sense of loss, for those who have been taken, whether they've passed or not, when the sense of loss still remains, that we would sit with them and allow them space for their stories. That we would retire inferior notions of success and strive for wholeness as communities. That we would be willing to cry in private, that we would stand in public, truly owning the stories of our community. The things that are brutal and beautiful, the atrocities and the apology. It's the only path to wholeness. This is my family now. And this is at the hospital in North Fremantle where I was taken from my mum. But the narrative has changed. No more is that the story of my family line. The things we go through as communities, the stories we confront, they can be challenging, they can be horrible, they can be awkward. But it's only through them that we get to wholeness. You can probably tell I am so proud of the family that I come from. My life has been enriched. I am so proud of whose daughter I am. My hope would be that as communities, we would be proud of our Aboriginal people. Thank you.